Welcome to the Circle Day show on Resonance 104.4 FM. This episode features Michael Albert. Michael Albert's radicalisation occurred during the 1960s. His political involvements, starting then and continuing to the present, have ranged from local, regional and national organising projects and campaigns to co-founding South End Press, Z Magazine, the Z Media Institute and ZNet. Currently host of the podcast Revolution Z and is a friend of Z Network. How did you become an anarchist? What led you to anarchist philosophy and then staying there?
Way back when, as you mentioned, in the 60s, I was radicalized by, I guess, my response to the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. I was in school at the time in Cambridge, Massachusetts, not England, Massachusetts. Becoming active, I began to look at various perspectives. I found myself very critical of the kind of Leninism that existed then. That's remained the case till now. I wrote a book called What is to be Undone instead of What is to be Done. And I found myself positive about much that I read in the anarchist tradition. But I don't go about identifying myself as this or that ism. I rather say what I think and write what I think, and people judge as they will.
What are some of the obstacles anarchists generally have faced over the years, decades and epochs of history in terms of resistance against the dominant culture?
For the most part, the biggest obstacle has been outright repression. A lesser obstacle has been the difficulty of communicating their sentiments in the environment you describe. And another obstacle has been a tendency to communicate rather poorly, often to be concerned more with expressing framework consistently with their own hearing of it as compared to thinking about how those they're trying to communicate with might hear what they have to say. Of course, the basic obstacle is that the society is organized in such a way that anarchism is a gigantic threat because it threatens the interests of those who are the beneficiaries of society's various hierarchies. And that continues up until the present. Of those three, it might be the anarchist's approach that has been an impediment. And that's good news because that can be corrected. One can do something about that, whereas the system is operating the way the system operates.
You're a market abolitionist. Do you think there is no such thing as a healthy competition in an economic model? Is the free market not a sign of libertary values?
In human history, I doubt that there is an invention that has done as much damage and harm for as long a time and at a comparable scale as markets. An outrageous claim, and yet I suspect it's probably true. But in any event, even if it's not that bad, it's horrendous. Markets pervert personality. They misvalue things, which leads to society pursuing lines of production and consumption that are harmful. They exclude what's called externalities, which is basically almost everything to do with human well-being and the environment. Thus, we have the slip slide toward social suicide. But the question you asked is more interesting, which is there a place for some kind of competition inside of a good society, a good economy? For example, two sports teams competing. If you and I play chess, we're competing. We're both trying to win. And if we're not trying to win, there's no game. There's nothing happening. And it might draw out the best of us if our attitudes toward competition are not to reward the victor, but to get the best result possible, which is quite different. In the economy, honestly, I'm not even sure what it would mean. Imagine a workplace. There's two lines of thought about how to produce something. How is that resolved? Maybe it's resolved by what would in essence be a competition. That is, each doing its thing and seeing which turns out better and the better one is implemented. So that's a kind of competition, and it's perfectly okay. Or you and I want the same job in the workplace. We are in the workplace. There are various kinds of what I call balanced job, and one of them needs only a few people, and we both want it. So in a sense, there's a competition. So in that limited sense, sure. But markets are something very different than that. Markets are a mechanism by which basically try to screw each other. They lack information about the well-being of others, the implications of their choices, so it's totally atomized. And again, it leads to a downward trajectory in all respects, in respect to the quality, in respect to the orientation of output, in respect to the state of the ecology, and so on, all of which we can see. There's nothing controversial about this. It's there. It's evident. The only way to not see it is to not want to see it because you don't want to face the reality that, oops, we need something other than market.
We don't want to incentivize cheating and malpractice.
And markets do exactly that. If my plant can dump its waste on the community, it can generate more profits. So I have an incentive to do that. That's correct. But even when markets are working sort of the way people want them to work, when they're the freest that you can imagine, that is, all the actors are comparable in size. Nobody has a substantial bargaining advantage over anybody else. They're still garbage. They still generate a distorted personality, a distorted set of preferences, distorted incentives of the sort that you're talking about, which quickly changes the environment to be more hierarchical, etc. I just want to be clear that the problem with markets isn't that sometimes they're misused. The problem with markets is that when they're used exactly the way they're meant to be used, they're horrendous.
It's no big secret that DARPA funds technological advancements. Is it conceivable to have technology but not have nefarious organizations behind it? Do we use good talent to improve the human experience or to destroy it? Would we still need to raise capital?
Yes, it's possible to have technological innovation on behalf of humans. Look, a pencil is a piece of technology. So is an assembly line or a machine to assassinate people. A hammer is a piece of technology. You can use it to hammer in a nail, and you can use it to crush somebody's skull. So part of the problem is how things are used, in the case of the hammer. Part of the problem is that some things are just so despicable that they're overwhelmingly intrinsically used for bad results. When used as they're intended, an assembly line, the result is the reduction of the people on the assembly line to rote behavior. That's just horrible, period. So it's not good assembly line, bad assembly line, it's bad assembly line. And thus, all that kind of technology is possible. But if you have an economic and a social system that's highly hierarchical, then the investment that goes into generating new technologies and the choice of how to use technologies will both be under the supervision of people at the top of those hierarchies. And that will yield the abysmal results that we see all around us.
How does the power that fiat money, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England and the stock market impact on lives and the policies that are formed all around us?
The sort of focus on money per se doesn't make much sense. The problem is the social relationships and the structures of the institutions, mechanisms to deal with adjudication and to deal with violations of, social norms and well-being will exist in a good society, I think. In other words, you can abuse it. Money, meaning a mechanism, a measure by which to help inform choices, will exist. It's not going to go away. And that use of something called money, or prices, more accurately, is okay. What's not okay is prices that are set by bargaining power and then utilized in order to maximize profit or to subordinate various constituencies in society. So this is a case where moving one's eyes to money is moving often one's eyes away from the social relations, the property relations, the organizational structural relations that are really the problem.
How would the centralized planning required to do big, long infrastructure projects work?
Well, first of all, it's not required to do big infrastructure projects. By central planning, we mean something, just like by markets, we mean something. Markets isn't the store where you go pick up something. The word market is applied to that precisely to confuse everybody, to think, well, if we don't have markets, if we don't have places we can get anything, we're all going to have nothing. So we have to have markets. Same idea with planning. Central planning is there are central planners, there's an apparatus, there's some mechanism. It provides a set of instructions that go to workplaces. The workplaces look at those instructions and they don't immediately follow. They say whether it's workable or not. It isn't the whole workforce that says that. It's a layer of leadership in the workplaces, sort of like managers in our workplaces. Message goes back to the central planners. So down go orders, up comes a comment. Down go orders, up comes another comment. Down go orders, up comes obedience. Central planning is a mechanism of control, of domination by a relatively small number of people, the determination of what's produced, how it's produced, where it goes, etc. So in those ways, it's horrendous. It's an authoritarian mechanism. And it's intrinsically authoritarian, just like markets have intrinsic attributes. And so when we were thinking about economics, I think because of our connection to anarchist writings, I don't really remember, we probably rejected central planning before we rejected markets. But it turns out you have to reject both because both lead to an economy that is misoriented and that also is class divided, decision makers and obedient sectors. And thus, when something called 20th century socialism has markets, so it's called market socialism, or has central planning, so it's called centrally planned socialism, in each case, it has one class on top and another class below. The class on top, I would call the coordinator class. Somebody else might call it something else. Doesn't matter. It's the set of economic actors who are empowered by what they're doing. Their situations in the economy give them access to decision making, give them confidence, give them information, and they dominate outcomes. And the other constituency, the working class, you basically follow the instructions, follow the orders, and are reduced in confidence. And the structure does that to them, like it does to those above. And so you have a class-divided society. And so for me, the thing that has been called 20th century socialism, I would call coordinatorism. Sometimes with markets, sometimes with central planning. In both cases, a class-divided, class-ruled society. Here's a little controversial addition. Not only do I think that the thing that has been called socialism most often, 20th century socialism, market socialism and centrally planned socialism, is actually not a society in which those who do the work and who do the consuming make the decisions, but a society in which a ruling class does so, a coordinator class, about 20% of the population. But I would go as far as saying that Leninism is the ideology of the coordinator class, not the ideology of the working class. You know, it's not the only issue to talk about, but that is certainly the core issue anarchists should be pointing toward when they are saying, well, wait a minute, we're anarchists because we're anti-capitalist, and we're also not very excited by this thing called Leninism. Well, that's the reason why.
How does this economic system rely on consumer culture and neoliberalism to keep it going?
It's not trivial, and there are many dimensions, but I guess it's easy enough to think about this way. If you have a workplace, corporation, and if it's privately owned, or if it's controlled by about 20% of the employees above the 80%, and if it is trying to amass wealth, the first priority isn't the impact of its activities on the well-being of the population. The priority is the amassing of wealth for those who can accrue it, the owners, or in the other case, the coordinator class. Then there's an interest in getting people to buy stuff that you have not made as well or as good or as desirable or as worthy as possible because you're cutting costs at every corner. So you want to create a situation in which people will buy things that will fall apart. You want them to keep buying. The rich, by and large, consume things that we might not like what they are, but they're well made. That is, they last. Because you can't pull that kind of shenanigans with people who have a degree of bargaining power. The rich have to be induced not to buy over and over something that breaks, but to buy bigger and bigger, so yachts. When you move from one size boat to the next, it isn't that your boat fell apart. On the lower end of the scale, we just buy over and over the same things. The clothes fall apart. The house breaks down and you have to, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think it's inevitable, but it is the way it is.
Have we entered late-stage capitalism? If so, what are the signs of it?
If late stage means near the end, the signs of it would be the growing and enriching, I don't mean monetarily enriching, I mean sort of consciousness enriching of an opposition. That's going to be the indicator, even in past revolutions, which didn't lead to what I wanted. So let's take Cuba. Was Cuba in late-stage capitalism? That's ridiculous. But what was going on in Cuba was there was the emergence of a tremendous amount of dissidents and the mechanisms for applying it to change the society. And the same for every other revolution. So the issue isn't some kind of internal contradiction in the nature of capitalism that's going to cause it to collapse and therefore it's in its late stages. The issue will be the contradiction between capitalism or any other system that we're talking about that's oppressive and the population. And when the population gets to the point that it perceives that, blames that on what should be blamed, the institutions of the society, and begins to rouse itself to fight against, that's the late stages. So, are we in the late stages? Well, I like to say it's the worst of times, but it's also not so far from being the best of times. Thinking that it's late stage because, I don't know, there's some kind of technology or the profit rate is vacillating somewhat or any of that kind of stuff makes no sense to me. All over the place in the United States, and I would even include on the right, that is at the base on the right, inside MAGA, a tremendous amount of dissatisfaction, of feelings of being ignored, of having no dignity, of being dismissed, etc., and also of growing material pain and suffering. Will that lead to right-wing blame gaming fascism? Or will that lead to the emergence of a serious resistance that not only tries to stop and does stop Trump and co., thus preventing fascism, but doesn't settle for getting back to where we were before it, but instead has in mind attaining a new society. But for that movement is going to need awareness. It's going to need to begin to understand what it wants. It's going to begin to have vision that goes beyond, we want freedom, we want justice, we want dignity, we want participation. All good, right? We want an end to misogyny. We want an end to patriarchy. We want an end to racism. All good. The trouble is that for most people in society, that doesn't mean much. Not because they don't understand the words. They understand the words. But because Bill Clinton says that, right? Everybody within the system on that other dimension who are trying to preserve the system says that. It doesn't mean anything that will get you to a new system unless you add some comprehension of what that new system is that you want to attain. How to organize society in a way that yields those values, in a way that's consistent with those values. So when you asked about markets, that's why I'm a market abolitionist, because those institutions are antithetical to those values. But that means it's incumbent to come up with institutions that are consistent with those values, that literally promote those values. That's the task of a revolutionary. Task of a revolutionary isn't just to say, what we've got sucks. It's true, but we need long since to be able to answer the question, which, if we listened, we would realize everybody asks us, okay, what are you for? And when we don't have an answer, they look at us and say, and you want me to take risks for chaos? People want some clarity about why they're going to attain something other than the old Soviet Union or fascism. When we say, vision, that's for the future, we're wrong. And that's a problem.
Ordinary people are at the mercy of the dictates of the market. Can direct action play a part?
You can't go into the store and change the price. So you're at the mercy of that. You can't go into the store and change the dynamics that went into the production, the fact that the product is inferior, the fact that there's pollution, etc. You can't do any of that as an individual. But you can put pressure on producers and put pressure on the market by what you choose to do, including various kinds of direct action, the most obvious being to withhold and not purchase, to boycott. Yes, it's possible. The labor market is what gives people their income. That is, you get a job and you get an income. That's a labor market. And pressure, unions can impact that. So yes, the answer is you can have an impact, but it would be much nicer instead of having to spend all your time struggling to get a little bit better from something that's horrible to replace the horrible thing so that you automatically get much better. So that's the difference between fiddling with it and replacing it, reforming it and having a revolution that replaces it. But I want to be clear, there's nothing wrong with reforms. There's something wrong with reformism, which says, I'd like this little change to preserve the system. Okay, that's not ideal, to say the least. But I'd like this change because it'll make people's lives better. I'd like this change because it will increase our ability to seek more change. That's fine. That's an essential part of achieving a new society. So yes, direct action can be useful in almost every situation that you can imagine.
Is the rise of Trump a rise of fascism? And would the landscape look much different were Hillary Clinton or Biden in the presidential seats? Are the problems systemic?
The answer is yes and no to all of it. That is to say, is it a rise of fascism? Yes. We now have in the United States a version of fascism, and it's getting worse and worse. You know, troops in the streets of Washington, D.C. right now, and contemplated for all over the country, and what we had 5 years ago. Now, does that mean that 5 years ago was wonderful? No. It then doesn't mean that the basic problems aren't systemic. They are systemic. But there's a difference between one situation and another situation, and that difference can be absolutely critically important. Okay, what are leftists? What do people who desire a new social system, who desire the things that I mentioned earlier, to get rid of exploitation, to get rid of the reduction of people to an undignified position of obedience, etc., to get rid of misogyny, to get rid of racism. People who want all that, what do we do now? To fight for reforms, because that's how people learn how the system works. That's how people become more radical. That's how people become connected in movements, in collective, massive outpourings. That's all to the good. And to do it in a way which furthers those additional ends is wonderful.
What is participatory economics? In the tangible and practical, who becomes the regulatory body? Who makes decisions that wins over all the other decisions?
In workplaces and in neighborhoods, decisions need to be made by the people who are affected. How does that happen? Well, there has to be a vehicle for that. And the vehicle for that is workers' councils and consumer councils with self-managed decision-making. Another institution is, what do people get? Well, it's called remuneration. So we're remunerated, paid wages, remunerated, a single word for it. What determines that? Well, it could be what we own. That's how Bezos and Musk are remunerated, based on what they own, profits. It could be based on power, bargaining power, how much we can take, and that is markets. A market system is a system in which how much you get is a function of how much you're strong enough to take. So that's a possibility. Another possibility is that people get back from the economy the amount that they put into it. So let's say I produce bicycles, I work on bicycles, I get back an equivalent value to the total number of bicycles That's another possibility. That one is 20th century socialist possibility. They didn't really achieve it, but they aspired to it. I don't like any of these. I think people should be remunerated, and this is another feature of participatory economic, for how long they work, for how hard they work, and for the onerousness of the conditions under which they work. Not for their power, not for their property, not even for the value that they produce. But why do I like that? Because I think it's equitable and just, because I think it is consistent with the values that we mentioned earlier. In existing economies, like in England and in the US, but also in the 20th century socialist economies. Inside workplaces, there was a division of labor. It isn't the case that everybody does all the same stuff. Tasks are divided up. In the corporate division of labor, tasks are divided up in such a way that some people do empowering tasks. They do tasks which give them confidence, give them information, give them access to decisions that are empowering. And other people do tasks that are disempowering, that are even designed to be disempowering, that reduce the amount of say they have, isolate them from other people, destroy their confidence, diminish their awareness of what's going on. The former group's about 20%, the latter group is about 80%. The 80% of the working class, as we understand it, the 20%, not just a little number, are the coordinator class. They're empowered. I don't like that division of labor. Why not? Because it creates class division and class rule. Because it blocks all those values we were talking about. So instead of that, what does participatory economics have? Well, it still has work. It still has jobs. It still has tasks. We just divide up the tasks differently. We do it so each job is comparably empowering to other jobs. Everybody is comparably equipped, prepared, even impelled by their economic circumstances to participate effectively in decision making. To me, that's a critical ingredient. If you don't do that, what happens is a class division emerges and it screws up your economy and it makes a situation that is exploitative. Then the last key institution of what's called participatory economics is how we do allocation. Do we use markets? No, for reasons we very briefly went over. Do we use central planning? No, for reasons we very briefly went over. It's historically been argued that those are the only two possibilities. If that's the case, those institutions, by their characteristics and the implications they have for human engagement, will reintroduce class division, class rule, alienation, etc. So allocation, we have to have a mechanism, structures, which enable the population, those workers' councils and consumers' councils, to decide what's produced and what's consumed, how it's distributed, and without ignoring most of what's important. So, for example, ignoring effects on the environment or effects on people, right? And that process, as simple as that sounds, leads to a plan, which is then flexibly implemented. Everybody has been involved. So if I remember right in your question, there was a question of who finally decides? Where does the power lie? And the answer is, this is what we have to accomplish. We all finally decide with an impact that's proportionate to the effect on us. That's what we're trying to achieve. So we're trying to achieve not that I decide what color socks you're going to wear, and not to decide, for the people in Cleveland to decide what the people in London are going to. It's for people to decide the circumstances that they're in and the decisions that impact them in proportion to the degree that they're impacted. That's what we call self-management. And that's what participatory planning claims to accomplish.
Can you address the claim that minimum wage increase or tax for the super wealthy would mean a loss of prosperity in a local area? Do we, the average person, rely on capital growth for a good quality of life?
Raising the minimum wage helps those who are most in need. Reducing the wealth of the rich, whether by taxes or any other means, brings us closer to a more equitable situation. That's the reason to do those things. If it inconveniences somebody at the top, tough. Does our well-being depend on growth? No, growth's not intrinsically a bad thing. If you can produce more with less expenditure of resources and time and effort, productivity up, that's a good thing. But on the other hand, it's not essential for, when you say people's well-being, whose well-being? The owners, yes. The owners typically need to compete, which means they need to generate more output and more revenue and thus more profit. But the rest of us, no. It's actually quicker and easier for us to be better off by way of redistribution of wealth, not increasing the size of the pie, but increasing the size of the piece that those who deserve more get. Now, under the current system, if you stop all growth and you go backwards or something and you don't make any other changes, it could disrupt the economy and everybody could suffer to a degree. But that's not what seeking higher wages does or other efforts on the part of unions and social movements to improve people's well-being.
Under this system, does immigration impact on the cost of living?
When there's a zero-sum game, you don't say, well, if it bothers somebody who's really well off, we won't do it. You instead say, well, those who are poorly off, those who are suffering, deserve to do better, and those who are really well off could do with much less. So that's the first part of the answer. By and large, immigration the issue is under this economy or under a good economy. Under this economy, immigration has all sorts of positive effects for various constituencies, not always all, including those at the top who get cheap labor, which they then exploit viciously. That's the part of immigration that should be cleaned up. If I suddenly came here from some other country, it shouldn't be the case that I'm super exploited because of that. It should be the case that I'm like anybody else. Now, even in this economy, like anybody else would mean like working people, and that's still not enough. It should be that everybody who comes in, like everybody who's here, enjoys a set of circumstances that are fulfilling and that utilize their capacities and so on. The situation does not warrant draconian, vicious repression and exploitation of people because they happen to have been born someplace else or whatever other reason. There's another issue around immigration that doesn't get addressed very often. It's partly, of course, racism, just outright, and nationalism. So that's part of it. It's partly people worrying about the economy, including people lower in the economy, fearing that their jobs will be taken. But I think there's another element, which is a sort of a cultural element, which is what the right is actually focused in on, much more than the left, with this idea of replacement. If you're in a rural area and you're in some relatively small town, where people know each other and people get along, etc., etc. And you may be suffering from drug addiction, oxycodone, all sorts of things. But you could also be afraid of immigration on grounds that if a whole lot of people come in with a different culture, it's going to be very disruptive.
Is changing the orientation to a class analysis and saying, hey, we don't actually want gentrification, wouldn't that be a healthier outlook rather than criticizing multiculturalism, which is a tale as old as time?
Having a class analysis, which entails more than usually goes with those words, because it entails paying attention to those who are working in rote and tedious work and those who are empowered also, is a good thing and would add to our understanding. If you ignore or you sort of try to sidestep issues of identity, I suppose you could call it, issues of the way people see themselves and relate to their community, you're not going to understand the whole picture, because the whole picture does very much embody that. So you can't tell somebody who's racist, ignore race, class is the only thing that matters. You also can't tell somebody who is just culturally concerned, ignore culture. Right? Instead, you have to say, well, what the truth is about those other phenomena. That there are diverse cultures and there are diverse ways of people living together, but it is possible to have those ways exist and be in support and mutual aid to each other rather than being in opposition to each other. That's what's crucial.
How can wealth, assets, and land hoarding be prevented systemically or by scenario?
If your economy is organized in such a fashion that the pursuit of wealth in the form of assets, of higher income, of land, is the reason for being, then you can't really prevent it in that type of economy. But what you can do is curtail it and try and reduce some of the ill effects of it, etc. So in our economy, where those things are made the centerpiece of the behavior of those with power, That is what they have to do, and it's because of the circumstances they find themselves in, as well as their own greed, which has developed over the course of a life. They weren't born with it. Okay, so in those circumstances, you mitigate the pain and you mitigate the suffering with reforms, like you mentioned, taxes on the rich, higher incomes for those who are relatively poorly off. And they can do even better than that. Those kinds of changes can be part of a process that's trying to change the whole economy so that the pursuit of wealth and power and land, etc., is not the logic of the system. The logic of the system is the pursuit of human well-being and development in a manner that is under the control of the people and so on.
What happens to those who cannot labour in an anarcho-socialist economy? What does the anarchist philosophy tell us?
In a good economy, it's not that different than what people tend to say it should be in a capitalist economy. That is, in a capitalist economy, most people say, well, look, I mean, if people can't work, I mean, they're disabled, they're sick, there's some impediment, they should be taken care of. Their well-being should be guaranteed by virtue of the fact that they're people and they're human and they deserve that kind of circumstance. They can't fulfill the responsibility of contributing because of their ailments or whatever it might be. But that's okay. All right. That's not it. It's not as if they're stealing from society. They're suffering, and we're making it less bad. In a good economy, in a good society, thing I call participatory society, if you can work and you can contribute to society, you do, and you get an appropriate, equitable amount of society's resources and benefits, and you also have control over your circumstances.
Talk about the relevance of general strikes and Labour's role in standing up against state policies of war and the exploitation of the working class.
Imagine a general strike. Imagine a lasting general strike. Imagine a lasting general strike in which lots of the workers are not only striking, but they're actually taking over the workplace. Is it plausible? Is it conceivable that workers would, in fact, do those things? Does it take a certain amount of awareness and a lot of organization and a certain amount of courage and all these things in order to pursue that path? Yes, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. That just means that it's difficult. Nobody said it was going to be easy to create a good society. When a workforce says, okay, we're going out on strike, what are they saying? They're saying to the owner, you give in on this demand or we're staying out and you're suffering. And they don't want to suffer. So they try and break the strike. If they can't break the strike, they give in. That's the way a strike works. But it's also the way other kinds of activism work. Say the generalized disruption, you mentioned war and peace. The generalized disruption that arises from growing movements, which also threaten the next generation of participation. In the 60s, that was a big part of the pressure on elites. The big part of the pressure on elites was, and they could see it in their own kids, was we're losing the next generation. And if we lose them, and if it goes far enough, well, it's not just the war that's at stake, it's the whole damn system. So we have to make some changes. So they did. They didn't necessarily do everything that it would have been desirable, but they stopped sending troops. They did this, they did that, trying to control the level of that opposition. Opposition matters. Same thing right now. But that kind of thing can be impacted by movements, by activism, by disobedience, and certainly also by strikes.
What is behind Israeli state power, and what does this reveal about the visceral entity of statism in all sorts of contexts, not just exclusively in the Middle East conflicts, that is blatant there for all to see?
The Israeli government, like the American government right now, is off the rails. Worse than anything about the intrinsic structure of the state requires. The intrinsic structure of the state is bad enough, but it doesn't mean you have to have a Nazi party. It doesn't, etc. Those things are not inevitable at any given moment in time. Let's use two words, state and polity. state is a particular kind of polity. It's a polity in which you have this apparatus above the population. You might have a masquerade in the form of elections and so on, but by and large, what you have is, for the political sphere of life, an apparatus which is out of control of the population. I mean, the United States is arguably supposed to be the most democratic country in the world. Well, the reality is that policy in the United States is impacted, except in the case of massive movements, not at all by the population. Not a little bit, but it's not impacted by the population. Continuously, the population polls show want X, Y, and Z, and continuously the government instead does A, B, and C, which the population doesn't want. And that's because the government operates above the population. So we'll call that a state, a government which operates above the population, or a polity which does. Those relations can also have built-in structural features which preclude one side from having an impact and guarantee that the other side dominates. That's the situation, and current governments, current political apparatuses have exactly that implication. They're structured in such a way that a particular elite dominates and most are subordinates. Do we want to get rid of the state, the government in the United States or in Israel or wherever, right? Yes, but we want to replace it with a polity which gives people control over their own lives.
In January 1970, you were expelled from MIT for your activism opposing the Vietnam War and the US military war research at MIT. What's your take on MIT, and is it a benign, amoral, neutral, or malevolent institution?
I used to call MIT Dachau on the Charles. I didn't think it was benign, I didn't think it was amoral, and I didn't think it was neutral, and I did think it was malevolent. Did that mean that everything at MIT was I was there, I wasn't malevolent. Chomsky was there, Chomsky wasn't malevolent. So no, of course it isn't a commentary on every single thing there. We were opposing war research at MIT, and MIT was claiming, well, we don't do any war research, which was patently ludicrous, right? Okay, so that's what was going on, so we didn't like that. We considered it malevolent. What about MIT now? Well, I'm not there, haven't been there in a long time. Every institution in our society is, at least to a considerable extent, sometimes mightily so, wired into the overall rough, broad, defining features of society. Take a hospital. What could be better than a hospital? Except that hospitals are profit-seeking organizations. And every day they do things that help people, that save lives, and they do other things that hurt people and take lives. When I was a kid becoming the activist at MIT, I tried to understand the concept alienation, and there was a guy named Bertolomé who had a definition that I liked, which is alienation is when something is aimed at other than human well-being and development. So every institution in our society is to a considerable extent alienated from human well-being and development.
Let's talk about AI. Can you respond to this? A fully automated luxury communism where the working classes overcome capitalist-defined work, transcend the limits of human biology, and claim only technology is to establish meaningful freedom for everyone, quoting communists on AI basically, rather than a final destination such a society merely heralds the real beginning of history. Do you have reservations about this way of thinking? What's the outcome of this kind of future? Is it really utopia that we want?
Yes, I do have reservations. First of all, in the present, the paramount things about AI is that it's a mechanism for extremely effective lying and manipulation, that it is a tool exceptionally useful for replacing workers because it doesn't strike and it doesn't need a lunch break and et cetera, et cetera. It's conceivable that it could become, I guess you could call it an enemy. This is the idea of a rogue AI, which has an agenda that's contrary to what anybody's telling it, any person is telling it, and to humans. Could there be some benefits from AI? Yeah, absolutely. But AI being used in the way that these people have in mind, and that is described all the time, it isn't just that it takes jobs, that humans might do. It ought to take rote, tedious, debilitating jobs with the income then distributed fairly among people who are displaced. It ought to do that. And that's what it's least well prepared to do, at least as of now. It also has a tendency to do things that are what makes life fulfilling. When AI replaces actors, when it replaces singers, when it replaces writers, when it replaces caregivers, doctors, when it replaces planning, when you have an AI assistant that plans your week for you, is that progress? Not obvious at all to me. When you have an AI assistant that reads to you and you stop reading and then it writes for you and you stop writing, is that progress? I don't think so. That danger is that AI used non-maliciously, nonetheless has a dynamic about it that's very, very dangerous. And the dynamic is usurping aspects of life from humans, which are essential to humans being human. The AI gets more human and humans get more machine-like. It's also an excuse to avoid having to say anything serious about institutions. Oh, technology will solve everything. So I don't have to figure out a good economy because everything's going to grow on trees. And I don't have to figure out, it's lazy. So on both those counts, I have problems with it, even if I could empathize with some individual who is saying those things. I don't want to, not hostile. I do have reservations, as you put it.
Do data centers contribute to ecological collapse that most are not fully aware of? Is this a part of the conversation environmentalists need to start to have, the extraction and energy consumption?
To the extent that AI requires massive computer banks and data serving, etc., that can, and now certainly does, utilize so much source of energy that it puts pressure on to maintain coal and oil, and it also increases the price of everything. And so it's disruptive in many ways. I root for an obstacle to the continued growth and strengthening, I don't know what to call it, diversification, improving of AI's capacity. I root for there to be an obstacle that stops it. I'm not sure that it's socially going to get stopped. So I'm hopeful that technically there'll be an obstacle. Because if there isn't, I at least worry greatly about this problem of usurping human dimensions. Have you ever heard the name, I think it's Tilly Norwood. She's an AI actress who is now subject to a race by agents in Hollywood to represent her. A lot of them are clamoring to do it. Why? Because it's incredibly realistic. I've seen it. Directors and writers and producers are going to say to themselves, we're in a competition. We've got to generate maximum profits, and we are going to employ this because it's much cheaper. Not only that, Tilly can work on 4 movies at once and never take a break. So you see that's the kind of encroachment, and directors and the producers are pretty stupid because they're next.
What's your understanding of consciousness and the shaping of one's perspective? Can you reflect on how and why propaganda is so effective in the social engineering of opinions in the general population as well? And does the population stand any chance in seeing through state manipulation?
Even if you look at MAGA and Trump formulations, most of the time they have to appeal to actual values. Freedom, we're going to get out from under the man. They are often based upon lies about what is. If you accept those lies, the rest sort of can follow. So one reason that propaganda can be effective is it's not the conclusion, it's the premises often that I think are what makes propaganda effective. And the other reasons are because people sometimes are just defending their own self-interest. So they're defending something, and the lies act well to do that. That's certainly the case. Fear plays a role, clearly, but I don't think it's only that. I think often what plays a role is wanting to be on a team. So I'm going to defend it because I'm loyal. It's a rabbit hole, especially if you go into rural areas in the United States and the towns are falling apart and the families are under incredible financial pressure and everybody has a relative or three that have suffered from oxycodone and other drugs. And along comes somebody who says, I'm going to fix it. Well, that's not enough because all politicians say that. But Trump says, I'm going to fix it. I'm going to turn the whole goddamn thing upside down. And actually, he's doing that, right? And people sort of react to that as good. Maybe something good will come out of that. Now, it's not long before they get sucked into defending their choice to vote for him by saying, okay, the deporting people is all right. And, so you go down this road toward worse and worse sort of things. Propaganda is a difficult question. But it is a good question. It's a right question, trying to understand, and it doesn't get addressed enough. I think they address it, they being the bad guys. They think about it. And it's easier for them because they have all this money and they have all these outlets and everything else. But our side is too quick to just dismiss people because they're saying something bad or because they're doing something bad without understanding why, without being able to speak to it. And that's just suicidal for us. So we have to become better on those fronts. We should be able to talk to MAGA people. I know it's completely incomprehensible. It's essential. It has to happen. We're not going to win without addressing these various audiences. So we have to learn how to do that. Some of us are pretty good at it, and they get attacked by the rest of the left.
Maybe the establishment actually has taken over the left. So it's a snobby kind of attitude.
The left has always had an anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-sexist inclination, also anti-authoritarian often. But it has also often, at times, inevitably, carried baggage from society. Part of the baggage that gets carried is, say, elements of racism or elements of sexism. But another part of the baggage that gets carried is elements of, let's call it classism, of a kind of elitism that's based upon we lawyers, we doctors, we engineers, we professors, we this, we that. We're cool, we're moral, we're smart, but it's often what's happening. And look, it's all of history is that way. Just as a sidebar, the left has to become what I think the best anarchists have been, which is attuned to all dimensions of life, all forms of elitism and domination. But it hasn't always been that.
Changing topic, you've brought up this subject on your podcast. What is your understanding of these types of Epstein and elitist networks? Would an anarchist perspective claim that there is hardly ever any accountability at the top anyway?
First off, it's much bigger than I think people realize. So Epstein was associated with massive bank, providing them clients. And the bank went along with what he was doing. And so did all sorts of elite figures throughout society. So it's very big. It's partly class, but it's also very much misogyny. Is it inevitable? It happened. And it's happened more than once. So, yes, existing institutions, existing patriarchal structures, something about the way we live in families, something about the way we conceive of interpersonal relations contributes to this and makes it, if not inevitable, highly likely. The class situation of Epstein and various others protects them.
Last month, on September the 25th, 2025, a US government statement was issued titled Countering Domestic Terrorism and Organized Political Violence. The White House is once again using the pretext of Homeland Security to wage war on domestic ground. Just as what happened after 9/11, where Edward Snowden, the NSA whistleblower, exposed violations of the First Amendment of the US Constitution, the protection of freedom of speech, which is the public expression of opinion without government censorship or restraint.
Martial law. He's testing moving the country into a state of central rule, not at the level that people are now talking about, but at a very different level. where it is, it's more like Nazi Germany. But then other people would say, nah, he's just a lunatic, because a lot of the things that he does are so crazy from his own interest point of view. What's the implication of putting the National Guard in LA and then in Washington, and now of calling together generals from all over the world, tell them that they have to view American cities as training ground for their ability to put down local opposition? I don't see how you can miss that the trajectory of that is toward a outright police state. Will that happen? No, I don't think so, because I think the opposition will be great enough to forestall it, and then to remove these elements, and then to move further toward a better society.
You have just been listening to the Circle Day Show on Resonance 104.4 FM. The Circle Day Show is an anarchist broadcast bringing you anarchist theory and all relating to it.